Have you ever stared at a leader on TV, in a boardroom, maybe even at work, and thought, how did that person get power? They seem overconfident, underqualified, maybe even dangerously incompetent. And yet, there they are, holding the reins. Meanwhile, the smartest people you know, thoughtful, measured, deeply capable, are stuck on the sidelines. It feels like some cruel inversion of merit. But what if it isn't a glitch, but a feature? What if power doesn't just tolerate foolishness, it rewards it? Centuries ago, the political philosopher Machiavelli warned us. It is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain his position to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge or not to use it according to necessity. Combine that with modern psychology, and a pattern emerges, one that explains Nero fiddling while Rome burned. Elizabeth Holmes building a $9 billion company on fake technology. And why, all too often, fools rise while the wise are ignored. It's one of the most unsettling paradoxes of power. Intelligence doesn't always help you rise. Sometimes it holds you back. The real world doesn't operate like a standardized test. Success isn't always awarded to those with the right answers. It often goes to those with the loudest voices, the boldest promises, or the most seductive illusions. Take Elizabeth Holmes, who convinced investors and politicians alike with a vision that never technically worked. Or Emperor Nero, whose theatricality masked disastrous incompetence. And yet, they ruled. Across history and psychology, a disturbing logic plays out. Appearing competent matters more than being competent. Why? Because real intelligence tends to come with nuance, self-doubt, and a sense of ethical restraint, qualities that can slow you down in a race for power. That's why the most brilliant people often stay in the shadows, while the foolish, confident, and morally unburdened take the spotlight. But here's the twist. Understanding why this happens doesn't just explain the past. It can give you the power to change the future, starting with how you see influence, authority, and even yourself. To understand this fully, we need to rewind 500 years to Renaissance Florence. Machiavelli wasn't writing in comfort or triumph. He'd been exiled, kicked out of politics by the very power games he later dissected. In his bitterness and brilliance, he wrote The Prince, a short, brutal manual on how rulers actually stay in power, not how they should behave in an ideal world. He wasn't interested in fantasy. He wanted to expose the machinery of control. And what he saw, over and over, was that success favored deception, theatrics, and manipulation more than virtue. One of his most piercing insights was this: everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. In other words, perception beats reality, especially when it comes to leadership. And once you understand that, so many baffling things make sense. Why do unethical CEOs get promoted? Why do bombastic politicians gain massive followings? Why do shallow influencers outpace thoughtful experts? Because most people see, but few people understand. Machiavelli wasn't cynical for the sake of it. He was realistic. And in his realism, he gave us the first tool for decoding why foolishness often floats to the top. This is where the trap begins. In a perfect world, intelligence would be the path to power. But in ours, it's often a barrier. Here's why. Intelligence doesn't just mean being right. It often means seeing complexity, acknowledging uncertainty, and questioning your own assumptions. These are virtues in science and philosophy. But in the world of power, they can be fatal weaknesses. Machiavelli saw this centuries ago. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. When image outweighs substance, then competence becomes secondary to charisma. And that's a dangerous shift, because genuine intelligence carries side effects: self-awareness, hesitation, ethical concerns. In a political or corporate arena where confidence trumps nuance, these traits look like indecision. That's why smart people can seem weak in power struggles. They think while others perform. They hesitate while others declare. And they doubt while others promise. The paradox isn't that fools accidentally gain power. It's that the system often selects for them. And unless we understand this dynamic, we'll keep mistaking noise for leadership and mistaking silence for weakness. So why, exactly, does intelligence so often become a liability in the pursuit of power? It's because the same qualities that define intellectual depth, curiosity, nuance, restraint, are liabilities in environments that reward speed, certainty, and spectacle. Truly intelligent people are often the first to say, "I don't know," not because they're unsure, but because they understand complexity. They hesitate before making promises. They weigh consequences. They notice the moral trade-offs others gloss over. But in a system built on perception, hesitation looks like weakness. Complexity looks like confusion. And humility looks like incompetence. Machiavelli saw this clearly. In a world where everyone sees what you appear to be, it's not the most capable who rise, it's the most confident. And confidence isn't always tied to truth. In fact, it often flourishes in its absence. That's why intelligent people are frequently outmaneuvered by less capable but more self-assured rivals. They're too thoughtful to bluff, too ethical to deceive, too self-aware to dominate. And so, in games of power, they get passed over, not despite their brilliance, but because of it. This is the core tragedy of Socrates, perhaps history's most famous casualty of intellectual integrity. "I know that I know nothing," he declared, a radical statement of epistemic humility. That mindset made him a philosophical giant. But politically, it made him vulnerable. He asked uncomfortable questions. He refused to play to the crowd. He acknowledged complexity in a culture craving simplicity. And so, Athens condemned him to death. Meanwhile, throughout history, populist leaders, those who speak in absolutes and make sweeping promises, win power by doing the opposite. They offer certainty, not nuance, clarity, not reflection, confidence, not caveats. In democratic societies and dictatorships alike, people gravitate toward those who say, "I alone can fix it." Not because it's true, but because it feels safe. Certainty, even if false, is psychologically more satisfying than truth wrapped in ambiguity. That's why, in the arena of leadership, Socratic self-doubt becomes a curse. The crowd doesn't want wisdom, it wants certainty, and it will reward those who deliver it, regardless of whether they should. That uncomfortable insight was echoed in a 2017 study published in the Journal of Management. Researchers found that intelligence correlates positively with leadership effectiveness, but only up to a point. Specifically, an IQ of around 120. Beyond that, something strange happens. As intelligence increases, the likelihood of emerging as a leader starts to decrease. Why? Because highly intelligent individuals often struggle to connect with people who can't follow their complex thought processes. They may seem aloof, overly analytical, or difficult to understand. And in leadership contests, especially unstructured ones, relatability often beats brilliance. So while smart people might be better at actually doing the job, they're less likely to get the job in the first place. The higher the intelligence, the harder it becomes to translate insight into influence. And in the game of power, that makes all the difference. But there's a darker mechanism at play. One that's not about intelligence at all. It's about perception. In the late 1990s, psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger documented a cognitive bias now known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. It describes how people with limited knowledge dramatically overestimate their competence, while genuine experts tend to underestimate theirs, precisely because they're aware of how much they don't know. Shakespeare captured this centuries earlier. The fool does think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool. And this isn't just poetic, it's observable. In 2020, a study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that individuals who displayed overconfidence were more likely to be perceived as leaders by their peers, regardless of their actual competence. In other words, the appearance of certainty was more persuasive than demonstrated expertise. This illusion of competence, where style overrides substance, plays out again and again. Think of George Armstrong Custer, whose supreme confidence earned him rapid promotions and devoted followers, until that confidence led to catastrophic military decisions. Or look at the tech world, where founders who speak in absolute visionary terms routinely secure billions in funding over more measured entrepreneurs. Adam Neumann of WeWork promised a revolution in how people worked and lived. His unshakable charisma built a cult-like following and attracted massive investment. The reality: a shaky business model and an eventual collapse. Or consider Masayoshi Son, head of SoftBank, who lost $70 billion on failed bets, yet maintained investor confidence through sheer force of personality. These aren't outliers. They're case studies in a recurring pattern. The Dunning-Kruger dynamic, amplified by our psychological shortcuts, means that boldness beats depth. Overconfidence masquerades as competence. And when perception rules, fools can lead. Let's go deeper. These patterns aren't just theoretical. They're visible across some of the most high-profile leadership failures of the modern era. Take Elizabeth Holmes. Her startup, Theranos, promised to revolutionize healthcare with a device that could run hundreds of tests on a single drop of blood. The technology never worked, but that didn't matter, because her image did. Holmes cultivated the look of genius. The black turtlenecks, the deep voice, the comparisons to Steve Jobs. Investors poured in billions. Politicians and media fell under her spell, all based on perception, not performance. Or look at WeWork's Adam Neumann. His startup was, in essence, a co-working space. But he sold it as a movement, a lifestyle, a redefinition of how humans connect. He radiated confidence, spoke in visionary absolutes, and cultivated near-religious loyalty. The business model was unstable. The losses were staggering. But for years, his confidence masked the cracks. He raised billions and built a cult before it all collapsed. Masayoshi Son, founder of SoftBank, was one of Neumann's biggest backers. Despite losing $70 billion on failed investments, he retained investor faith. Why? Because his persona projected certainty. And in uncertain markets, certainty, even misplaced, can be magnetic. Now consider Russia's post-Soviet privatization era. Oligarchs didn't rise because they were competent managers or economic visionaries. They rose through connections and confidence. The rules were unclear, the institutions weak. In that chaos, charisma and ruthlessness, not capability, became the currency of power. But in Singapore, the pattern breaks. There, safeguards were intentionally built to prevent confidence from trumping competence. The system was designed to filter for substance over style. Which raises the question, what if the problem isn't the leaders? What if it's the system that selects them? Research from Stanford and the University of Houston in 2012 offers a disturbing clue. In unstructured groups, think project teams, startups, or early-stage political movements, narcissism, not competence, was the strongest predictor of who emerged as the leader. Narcissistic individuals were more likely to dominate attention, speak with authority, and assert control. The twist? These groups believed they performed better under narcissistic leadership, even though objective outcomes didn't improve. In other words, the perception of success followed the projection of confidence. Narcissism wasn't just tolerated, it was rewarded. And once that dynamic takes root, it becomes self-reinforcing. Machiavelli would have recognized this instantly. One of his most damning observations was this: the first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. Incompetent leaders, he observed, tend to surround themselves with even less competent subordinates. Why? Because competence threatens them. They fear being outshined, challenged, or replaced. So instead of hiring the best, they hire the most loyal. Organizational psychologists describe this as competence-threatening behavior. Insecure leaders avoid talent to protect their own status. You've probably seen this dynamic at work. The manager who promotes the yes man, the executive who ignores the expert, the leader who views questions as insubordination. It's not just petty, it's strategic. By weakening the layers beneath them, these leaders ensure their own survival. But at what cost? Left unchecked, this creates a cascade effect. Institutionalized incompetence. History offers brutal examples. In Emperor Commodus's Rome, capable administrators were systematically replaced by flatterers and entertainers. The result? Accelerated decay. In modern Brazil, the Centrome political system allowed political appointees to secure positions through personal connections, not merit. Governance suffered, but loyalty thrived. Zimbabwe, under the later years of Mugabe, saw the same rot. Competent civil servants were replaced by partisan loyalists, leading to devastating economic consequences. This phenomenon is known as homopi, or homophily, the tendency of people to associate with others like themselves. In power structures, it creates islands of mediocrity, environments where hard questions are unwelcome, where challenges are punished, where asking for clarity gets you labeled not a team player. Over time, the organization doesn't just become ineffective, it becomes immune to improvement. And that's how empires crumble, not through one spectacular failure, but through 1,000 silent compromises, driven by insecurity at the top. Even knowing all this, many of us still fall for the illusion. We follow leaders who offer simple answers to complex problems. Why? Because psychologically, we're wired to crave certainty, especially in times of crisis. The human brain doesn't like ambiguity. It seeks closure, even when that closure is false. In cognitive psychology, this is called the need for cognitive closure, the desire for clear, definitive answers rather than ongoing uncertainty. Machiavelli understood this long before psychology gave it a name. For the great majority of mankind are satisfied with appearances as though they were realities, and are often more influenced by the things that seem than by those that are. It's not that people are foolish. It's that appearances satisfy a deeper emotional need. This plays out every day. Look at how scientists talk about climate change. Carefully, with probabilities and caveats. Now compare that to how public figures on both sides of the debate frame it, with stark ultimatums and total certainty. One is intellectually honest. The other is psychologically satisfying. The same goes for healthcare debates. Actual experts acknowledge trade-offs and systemic complexity. Politicians offer sweeping solutions with no downsides. And guess which message tends to win public support? In 2017, researchers at Yale ran an experiment. They gave participants complex policy data with clear mathematical answers. But when the answers contradicted their political beliefs, even the most numerically skilled participants distorted the math to match their bias. Intelligence didn't shield them. It sharpened their rationalization. That's the power of cognitive closure. And that's why simplistic, overconfident leaders often succeed, because certainty feels better than truth. Now here's where Machiavelli gets truly unsettling. The qualities that define moral character, honesty, empathy, restraint, can actually be liabilities in the pursuit of power. It is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain his position to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge or not to use it according to necessity. This isn't a license for evil, it's a diagnosis. In ruthless environments, ethical restraint limits your available strategies. But those without such constraints, they can lie without guilt, promise without limits, attack without hesitation. Cicero, for instance, brilliant, principled, deeply respected, was crushed by Julius Caesar, who crossed the Rubicon both literally and symbolically. Caesar broke political norms Cicero would never touch, and he won. Modern research echoes this dynamic. A study from the University of British Columbia found that psychopathic traits, like lack of empathy, are positively associated with rapid career advancement, especially when paired with social charm. This isn't limited to one culture. In China, the archetype of the Shennu, or ruthless businesswoman, reflects the same pattern. In Nordic countries, despite cultural emphasis on collaboration, manipulative leaders often rise faster than their more ethical peers, and this creates a race to the bottom. If unethical tactics win, others feel pressured to adopt them just to survive. Over time, the whole system shifts, not because everyone is evil, but because no one can afford to be outplayed. Ethics becomes a handicap, and power, once again, rewards those willing to cross lines others won't. But not every system leads to this outcome. The environment matters. Some structures naturally expose incompetence. Others conceal and reward it. Think about a surgeon or an engineer. If their work is flawed, people die or bridges collapse. The feedback is immediate, clear, and brutal. These fields select for competence by necessity. Now contrast that with politics, where results can always be blamed on predecessors or external forces, or corporate hierarchies, where creative accounting can hide failure for years, or media, where performance is measured in engagement, not truth. These environments allow incompetence to survive and even thrive, because failure isn't always obvious. Power structures also play a role. Centralized systems with weak checks and balances are fertile ground for bad leadership. The Soviet Union's collapse, for example, was accelerated by decision-making concentrated in unaccountable hands. Meanwhile, Germany's dual-board corporate governance, where management is formally separated from oversight, acts as a structural safeguard against incompetent or corrupt leadership. Information asymmetry compounds the problem. When outcomes are subjective or difficult to evaluate, appearance once again beats reality. As Machiavelli put it, men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand because it belongs to everybody to see you, to few to come in touch with you. In other words, most people rely on surface impressions because they don't have access to the full picture. Short-term incentive structures also feed the problem. In the years leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, executives were rewarded for short-term profits, even when those profits were built on systemic risk. the result was catastrophic. But the system had rewarded the appearance of success, not its sustainability. So what tactics do incompetent leaders use to not only rise, but stay in power? First, they exploit tribalism. By creating strong in-groups and out-groups, they frame any criticism as an attack from the enemy. This is known as identity fusion, when a leader fuses their image with a group's identity. At that point, to question the leader feels like betraying the tribe. Jim Jones mastered this dynamic. So did authoritarian regimes throughout history. Malaysia's Najib Razak used ethnic divisions to maintain power, even amid corruption scandals. Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro used cultural polarization to rally his base and insulate himself from accountability. Second, they manufacture chaos. By constantly generating controversies, they overwhelm the public's cognitive bandwidth. When every day brings a new scandal or crisis, people stop asking big questions. They're just trying to keep up. This overload short-circuits critical thinking. Third, they manipulate reality itself. George Orwell called it doublethink, the ability to hold contradictory beliefs at once. In the hands of a skilled manipulator, history is rewritten daily. Standards shift. Truth becomes a moving target. Machiavelli wasn't being elitist when he wrote, "The vulgar crowd always is taken by appearances, and the world consists chiefly of the vulgar." He was naming a vulnerability all humans share. We're drawn to spectacle, even when it deceives us. Fourth, they exploit economic precarity. When people are struggling, financially or emotionally, they're more likely to embrace leaders who offer simple scapegoats. In post-industrial regions worldwide, fear becomes a political accelerant. It drives people into the arms of those who promise quick fixes, even if those promises are hollow. None of these tactics are accidental. They're a strategic playbook, one Machiavelli would have recognized centuries ago. And they work, not because people are stupid, but because the system is fragile and the psychology predictable. But here's the hopeful truth. What's predictable can also be defended against. If this all feels bleak, it shouldn't, because the very predictability of these dark dynamics gives us power, the power to resist them both individually and collectively. And that starts with what we cultivate in ourselves. First, intellectual humility. The ability to say, "I might be wrong," is a superpower in a world of false certainty. Research shows that intellectually humble people are better at evaluating information based on evidence, not emotion. Intellectual humility functions like a cognitive immune system, protecting us from manipulation just as our body's immune system fights infection. Second, media literacy. Warren Buffett once said, "Really successful people say no to almost everything." Apply that to information. Learn to filter out spectacle. Choose sources deliberately. Question how things are presented, not just what is said, but why. Train your attention like you'd train your body. Third, philosophical reflection. The ancient Stoics practiced daily review, stepping back from the storm to ask, what really matters? Francis Bacon put it this way, "The wise man will make more opportunities than he finds." Reflection helps you shape your mental environment instead of being shaped by it. But individual defenses alone aren't enough. We need to reimagine the systems we live in, and that starts with institutional design that doesn't reward charisma over competence. First, accountability. Think of the difference between a company with an independent board versus one where executives rubber stamp each other's decisions. The Boeing 737 MAX tragedy happened, in part, because engineers' concerns were ignored. profits prioritized over safety. There were no breaks. Second, cognitive diversity. Diverse teams across disciplines, experiences, and backgrounds don't just feel good, they're more accurate. They catch blind spots homogeneous groups miss. They challenge assumptions. They help organizations see the full picture. Third, transparency. When power hides behind complexity, incompetence festers. But systems with sunshine laws, public audits, and conflict of interest disclosures make it harder to hide behind jargon. Singapore's structural safeguards show it's possible to build systems where style doesn't outpace substance. And all of this must be rooted in how we educate, not just children, but citizens. Education should be more than job training. It should teach how to think, not just what to do. The Athenians built the academy. The Florentines nurtured the humanists. Civilizations rise not when they produce more technicians, but when they cultivate more wisdom. We must teach critical thinking, ethical reasoning, and the courage to hold ambiguity. Because the future doesn't belong to those with all the answers. It belongs to those who know how to ask better questions. So let's return to the question that started this journey. Why do foolish people so often rise to power? Because perception beats reality. Because confidence beats competence. Because the systems we live in reward certainty over truth, spectacle over substance. But Machiavelli didn't write to justify these dynamics. He wrote to expose them. It is not titles that honor men, but men that honor titles. Power deserves no respect on its own. It must earn it. When we understand how these forces work, we stop being pawns in the game and start shaping it. Intelligence alone isn't enough, but intelligence plus moral courage, that's our best hope for better companies, better governments, better futures. So, what patterns have you seen in your own community? Have you watched the loudest rise while the wisest stayed silent? Share your story in the comments. Start the conversation. Understanding the darkness doesn't mean surrendering to it. It means gaining the power to create light.